In marine sediments separated by entire oceans, the same body shape appears again. It does not belong to a single lineage. It does not trace back to one recent ancestor. And yet, over spans of more than 100 million years, different animals arrive at nearly identical forms. A broad, flattened shell, legs angled outward, built for sideways movement, an abdomen folded tightly beneath the body. This pattern does not emerge once and disappear. It repeats. Fossils from distant geological periods show different starting forms ending in nearly the same structure. Creatures that began with long bodies and exposed abdomens gradually compress into something compact, armored, and almost identical to one another. They were not closely related when they began. They do not share the same evolutionary path, and still they converge. In shallow reef systems, in coastal waters, in environments that never touched, this transformation appears repeatedly. Entire lineages shift toward a shape they did not begin with, as if constrained by something deeper than chance. Scientists have named this pattern convergent evolution, but naming it does not explain why it happens so often or why the result is so consistent. Convergent evolution usually produces resemblance. This produces something closer to repetition. But why this structure? Why does evolution return to it across so many separate histories? In this video, we will follow what the fossil record and modern biology reveal about this transformation, and why evolution keeps returning to the same design. On a quiet stretch of shoreline, where the tide withdraws and leaves the seafloor exposed, small shapes scatter across the wet sand. At first glance, they seem identical, each carrying the same flattened outline, the same sideways motion, the same quiet efficiency. But beneath that shared silhouette, the story divides. A true crab is not defined by appearance alone. Its form follows a specific arrangement, one that has settled into a stable design over immense spans of time. The body is capped by a broad carapace, smooth or textured, but always wide relative to its length, like a shield pressed low against the world. Beneath it, 5 pairs of legs extend outward. The front pair forms claws, capable of grasping, cutting, or lifting, while the remaining legs carry the animal in a sideways rhythm that feels both deliberate and fluid. Hidden beneath this structure lies one of the most defining traits. The abdomen, once long and exposed in distant ancestors, is now folded tightly under the body. It is compact, protected, almost invisible from above. This folding changes everything. It draws the center of mass inward, reduces vulnerability, and reshapes how the animal interacts with its surroundings. What was once extended and fragile becomes contained and reinforced. This combination, a wide carapace, 10 legs, and a tucked abdomen, marks what biologists recognize as a true crab. It is a precise identity, not a casual label. Yet the ocean does not always respect such boundaries at first glance. Scattered across reefs and hidden within rocky crevices are creatures that seem to follow the same blueprint, but do not belong to this lineage. Some have similar shells, others share the sideways gait, and many present the same compact posture. They appear, in every practical sense, to be crabs, but their ancestry tells a different story. These are the imposters, forms that arrived at the same destination by entirely separate paths. Their internal structures differ in subtle but important ways. Some retain traces of longer abdomens, partially folded but not fully integrated. Others reveal differences in limb arrangement or developmental stages that trace back to origins far removed from true crabs. Their resemblance is convincing, almost indistinguishable without close study, yet it is a resemblance built through convergence, not inheritance. The distinction carries weight because it separates identity from outcome. A true crab represents a lineage that evolved into this form and remained within it. The others demonstrate that the form itself can be reached repeatedly, shaped by forces that guide unrelated animals toward the same solution. Without this separation, the pattern would blur into coincidence. With it, the repetition becomes undeniable. In museum collections and genetic analyses, these differences resolve into clear branches. True crabs occupy one path, defined by shared ancestry. The lookalikes occupy others, branching away long before the crab shape emerged. And still, across these divisions, the same structure appears again and again, as if drawn from a common template that exists beyond lineage. Understanding what counts as a crab sets the boundary for what follows. It clarifies that similarity does not guarantee relation, and that form alone can be misleading. More importantly, it reveals that the crab shape is not owned by a single group. It is a destination that multiple groups have reached independently across deep time. With that boundary in place, the pattern sharpens. What seemed like a single evolutionary story begins to fragment into many, each starting from a different origin, each moving toward the same quiet, flattened design. The record does not unfold as a single line, but as many, separated by time, by geography, by ancestry, that diverged long before the crab form appeared. When these lines are traced carefully, they do not converge at a shared beginning. They begin apart, carry their own histories, and yet arrive at a similar shape as if guided by a quiet constraint that operates beyond lineage. Among the most striking of these paths are the king crabs. Their present form carries the same compact body and outward-reaching legs, yet their origin lies elsewhere, within a group once defined by softer bodies and borrowed protection. Their distant ancestors moved with elongated abdomens, seeking shelter in discarded shells, dependent on what the environment could provide. Over immense spans of time, that dependence fades. The abdomen shortens, then folds, then tucks inward. The borrowed shell is abandoned, replaced by a hardened exterior that grows from within. What remains is something that no longer resembles its origin, yet aligns closely with the crab form. Elsewhere, another lineage follows a different route. Porcelain crabs, delicate in appearance, emerge from ancestors that share closer ties to squat lobsters than to any true crab. Their bodies flatten, their claws become pronounced, their movements shift toward the same lateral rhythm. They appear, at a glance, indistinguishable from those that evolved along entirely separate paths, yet their internal structures, their developmental sequences, and their genetic signatures reveal a history that never passed through the same ancestral gateway. In colder waters and along rugged coastlines, hairy stone crabs trace yet another variation. Their surfaces carry textures adapted to their surroundings, but beneath that exterior lies the same transition toward compactness. Limbs reposition, abdomens contract, and the overall body plan settles into a familiar arrangement. Each transformation follows its own pace, shaped by local pressures, yet the destination remains strikingly consistent. These are not isolated cases, they are fragments of a broader pattern that stretches across deep time. Fossil records, though incomplete, preserve moments along these transitions. Intermediate forms appear, carrying partial features, bodies that have not yet fully compressed, or limbs that still hint at older configurations. These fossils do not form a single continuous chain. Instead, they appear in separate branches, each documenting a different lineage, moving toward the same structural outcome. Genetic analysis deepens this separation. When the DNA of these animals is compared, it does not cluster them into a single group. Instead, it reveals distances, clear divisions that trace back to ancestors that lived in entirely different contexts. The similarities seen on the surface dissolve at the molecular level, replaced by patterns that confirm independent origins. What looks unified from above is in fact a collection of separate histories. The timing of these transformations adds another layer to the pattern. Some lineages began their shift tens of millions of years earlier than others. In one branch, the transition unfolds gradually through ancient seas, while in another, it appears later, emerging under different environmental conditions. These timelines do not overlap neatly. They are staggered, unfolding in different eras, under different climates, and within ecosystems that never intersected. As these discoveries accumulated, the realization formed slowly, then all at once. What had been interpreted as variation within a single lineage revealed itself as repetition across many. The same form, reached again and again, without shared ancestry to explain it. The recognition did not come from a single fossil or a single study, but from the accumulation of evidence that refused to align with a simpler narrative. In that accumulation, the pattern becomes undeniable. Multiple lineages, separate in origin and separated by time, arrive at nearly identical structures. Not once, but repeatedly across the long history of marine life. Long before their heavy forms settled against the seafloor, the ancestors of king crabs moved through their world with a different kind of vulnerability. Their bodies extended backward into soft, unprotected abdomens, exposed to the pressures of a crowded environment. To compensate, they relied on objects not their own, slipping into empty shells left behind by others, carrying these borrowed shelters as they navigated the shifting terrain. This dependence shaped their behavior and their structure. The abdomen remained long and flexible, curved to fit the spiral interiors of the shells they occupied. Movement required coordination between body and shelter, a constant negotiation between protection and mobility. Over time, subtle changes began to emerge. The abdomen, once an extended necessity, started to shorten. Segments reduced, the curve tightened, and the reliance on external housing began to loosen. Across generations, this transformation continued, not as a sudden shift, but as a gradual reconfiguration. The abdomen folded closer to the body, losing the elongated form that once defined it. At the same time, the upper surface strengthened. A more rigid exterior developed, spreading across the body like a shield that no longer needed to be supplemented by scavenged protection. The animal carried its defense within its own structure. Fossil evidence captures fragments of this transition, preserving stages that lie between the fully extended forms of earlier ancestors and the compact bodies seen later. Some specimens reveal partially reduced abdomens, still visible but no longer dominant. Others show a further integration where the abdomen tucks inward, becoming less exposed and more protected. These fossils do not form a continuous sequence, but together they outline a direction, a steady movement toward compression and reinforcement. As the abdomen diminished in prominence, other features adjusted in response. The legs repositioned, spreading outward to support a broader body. The claws became more pronounced, capable of interacting with the environment in new ways. The entire posture shifted, lowering the center of gravity and stabilizing the animal against external forces. What had once been a creature dependent on external shells became one that carried its own armor, shaped by internal change. Genetic analysis provides a deeper layer to this transformation. When the DNA of modern king crabs is examined, it aligns not with true crabs, but with hermit crabs, confirming their origin within a lineage defined by shell dependence. The genetic markers trace back through time, linking present forms to ancestors that bore little resemblance to the compact structures seen today. This connection does not rely on surface similarity, but on inherited sequences that reveal shared history beneath the visible form. The shift from hermit crab to king crab is not a simple progression, but a complex reworking of anatomy and function. Developmental pathways adjust, altering how segments grow and how tissues organize. Changes in gene expression guide the reduction of the abdomen and the expansion of the protective exterior. These changes accumulate slowly, each generation carrying slight variations that, over vast periods, reshape the entire body. In this transformation, the crab form emerges not from a lineage that began with it, but from one that moved steadily toward it. The process does not erase the past, but builds upon it, modifying existing structures until they align with a different configuration. What remains visible is the final result, a compact, armored body that mirrors forms found in entirely separate lineages. Within the broader pattern, the king crab stands as a clear example of this repeated direction. A lineage that once depended on borrowed shelter arrives, through gradual change, at a form that no longer requires it, settling into a structure that echoes across the history of marine life. In tide pools that form and vanish with the turning of the sea, another lineage settles into a familiar outline. These animals are smaller, often more delicate in appearance, their surfaces smoother, their movements lighter. At a glance, they carry the same compact presence, the same lateral rhythm, the same sense of a body shaped to press close against its surroundings. Yet their history traces back along a path that never passes through the lineage of true crabs or the transformations seen in king crabs. Porcelain crabs emerge from ancestors more closely aligned with squat lobsters, creatures whose bodies once extended outward in a different balance, with abdomens more visible and forms less compressed. In their early stages, the proportions reflect this origin. The body is not yet flattened to the degree seen later, and the limbs maintain a configuration that hints at a different structural plan. Over time, this arrangement begins to shift. The upper surface broadens, gradually expanding into a wider shield that covers more of the body. The overall form lowers, drawing closer to the substrate beneath it. The abdomen, though not identical in its transformation to that of other crab-like lineages, reduces in prominence and becomes less exposed. It folds inward to a degree, becoming less central to the outward shape and more integrated beneath the body. At the same time, the front claws become more dominant. They enlarge relative to the rest of the limbs, taking on roles that extend beyond simple grasping. These claws interact with the environment in precise ways, sorting particles, gathering food, and engaging with the surrounding space. The remaining legs adjust accordingly, supporting a body that has shifted its balance toward a broader, flatter configuration. This process unfolds gradually, shaped by pressures that favor compactness and stability. The resulting form aligns closely with the structure seen in other crab-like animals. The resemblance is striking, not only in outline but in function. Movement, posture, and interaction with the environment follow similar patterns, as if guided by a shared set of constraints. Yet beneath this similarity, the differences remain clear. Genetic analysis places porcelain crabs far from true crabs and from the lineage that produced king crabs. Their DNA reflects a separate origin, a distinct evolutionary path that diverged long before any of these transformations began. The genes that guide their development, while producing a similar outward form, do so through pathways that are not identical to those found in other crab-like groups. Developmental stages reveal further distinction. Larval forms pass through sequences that differ in subtle but consistent ways, reflecting their unique ancestry. The timing of growth, the arrangement of segments, and the progression of anatomical changes all carry signatures of a lineage that followed its own trajectory. The final result may appear familiar, but the route taken to reach it is not the same. This repetition, emerging from a completely separate origin, reinforces the pattern that has been quietly forming. The crab-like shape does not belong to a single history. It is not confined to one branch of life's unfolding. Instead, it appears again, shaped by forces that operate across different lineages, guiding them toward a similar structural outcome. Within this context, porcelain crabs stand as another clear instance of convergence. Their form is not inherited from a common crab ancestor, but assembled through gradual change within a different lineage. The resemblance is real, but it is built independently, shaped by pressures that act consistently across separate histories. As more of these examples come into focus, the pattern deepens. What once seemed like an isolated transformation begins to resolve into a recurring theme, one that extends beyond individual lineages and reveals a broader tendency within the marine world. Numbers begin to gather quietly in the margins of this pattern, not as exact counts but as approximations shaped by fragments of evidence. Each independent lineage that has arrived at a crab-like form adds to a tally that remains incomplete, shifting as new discoveries emerge. Some estimates suggest only a handful of such transformations, while others extend the count further, recognizing additional branches where similar structural changes have occurred. These estimates are not fixed. They depend on how clearly each transformation can be identified and on how confidently separate origins can be distinguished. In some cases, the boundaries are sharp, supported by genetic data and fossil remains that align cleanly. In others, the lines blur, leaving room for interpretation. What appears to be a single event may conceal multiple transitions, compressed by gaps in the record or obscured by later modifications. Among evolutionary biologists, this uncertainty has become part of the discussion itself. Different analyses, using different methods, arrive at slightly different counts. Some researchers emphasize conservative interpretations, grouping certain forms together when the evidence is incomplete. Others separate them, pointing to subtle distinctions in anatomy or development that suggest independent origins. The result is not disagreement in the existence of the pattern, but in its precise extent. As the conversation unfolds, one detail remains consistent. The number is not small. Even the most restrained estimates recognize multiple independent events, each representing a lineage that moved toward the same compact structure without sharing a direct path. More expansive interpretations increase this number, suggesting that the pattern may be more common than initially assumed. Part of this uncertainty arises from the nature of the fossil record itself. Preservation is selective, capturing only a fraction of the organisms that once existed. Conditions must align for a body to leave an imprint, and even then, time may erase or distort what remains. Soft tissues are rarely preserved, and even hardened structures can fragment or disappear. Between the fossils that have been found lie vast intervals where transformations could have occurred without leaving a trace. Within these gaps, entire sequences may be hidden. A lineage could have begun to compress its body, gradually adopting features that align with the crab form, yet left no preserved stages to document the process. Another could have completed the transition, existed for a period, and then vanished, its presence erased before it could be recorded in stone. These possibilities extend the pattern beyond what is directly visible. Genetic studies offer another window, but they too are limited to living species and those whose DNA can be inferred. They reveal relationships and distances, helping to identify independent origins among existing forms. Yet, they cannot fully reconstruct lineages that have no surviving descendants. For those, The fossil record remains the only guide, and where it is silent, the count remains uncertain. As evidence accumulates, the pattern grows not only in clarity, but in scale. Each additional example, each newly recognized lineage, expands the sense of repetition. What once seemed like a rare occurrence begins to appear as a recurring feature of evolutionary history, unfolding across different times and conditions. The exact number may remain unresolved, shifting with each discovery and each reinterpretation, yet the direction is clear. The crab-like form has emerged more than once, and likely more often than the current record can fully reveal, its repetition extending beyond the limits of what has been preserved. Pressure accumulates, not in a single moment, but as a constant presence, shaping every movement along the seafloor. The ocean, often imagined as vast and open, becomes something else when traced along its bottom. Space narrows, surfaces fill, life presses against life in a quiet, continuous density. Across this terrain, shelter exists as a limited resource. Crevices, overhangs, fragments of rock or coral, each offers a small refuge, and each is already contested. An exposed body remains visible from multiple angles, its outline easy to detect against the shifting background. The difference between concealment and exposure is often measured in small adjustments of shape, in how closely a body can settle against the ground or slide into the narrow spaces that interrupt it. Predation moves through this environment without pause. Fish pass overhead, scanning for movement. Other invertebrates search along the substrate, probing gaps and turning fragments in search of anything unprotected. The threat is not occasional, it is continuous, embedded in the daily rhythm of the ecosystem. Under such conditions, protection becomes inseparable from structure. A body that can shield itself without relying on external objects gains a consistent advantage. At the same time, the water itself exerts its own influence. Waves transfer energy downward, their force diminishing with depth but never fully disappearing. In shallower regions, currents sweep across the seafloor, shifting sediment, pushing against any form that rises too far above the surface. A body that stands tall or extends outward meets resistance, catching the flow and risking displacement. Stability becomes a matter of geometry, of how a shape interacts with moving water. A lower profile reduces that interaction. When a body flattens and spreads, it presents less surface area to the current. The force of moving water passes over it rather than against it. This reduction does not eliminate motion entirely, but it lessens the tendency to be lifted or rolled. The animal remains in contact with the ground, anchored not by attachment, but by form. The distribution of mass plays an equally quiet role. A higher center of gravity introduces instability, allowing external forces to create leverage. When the center of mass shifts closer to the substrate, that leverage diminishes. The body resists tipping, maintaining its orientation even when currents fluctuate. This stability is not static but dynamic, allowing movement while preserving balance. Flattened shapes extend this advantage further. By spreading weight across a broader area, they reduce pressure on any single point, allowing the body to settle more securely against uneven surfaces. Edges conform to the contours of the seafloor, creating a closer fit that resists displacement. Rolling, which would expose vulnerable areas and disrupt control, becomes less likely when the form itself discourages rotation. These physical constraints operate alongside biological pressures, reinforcing one another. A shape that offers protection also interacts more efficiently with the forces of water. A structure that reduces drag also enhances stability. Over time, these combined effects guide the direction of change, favoring forms that align with both sets of demands. Within this environment, the crab-like body emerges not as an isolated solution, but as one that meets multiple requirements at once. Its compactness reduces exposure, its flattened profile lowers resistance, and its mass remains close to the ground. These traits do not arise independently. They converge, shaped by the same conditions that define life along the seafloor. The ocean, in this sense, does not act as a neutral stage. It filters, presses, and reshapes, guiding different lineages toward forms that can persist within its constraints. Force moves through water in quiet, persistent ways, shaping every surface it encounters. For bodies that live within it, form becomes a negotiation with that movement, a balance between resistance and flow. The compact structure seen in crab-like animals aligns closely with these conditions, not as an abstract design, but as a response to how water behaves. When a body reduces its overall extension and draws its mass inward, the surrounding flow encounters fewer irregularities. A streamlined outline allows water to pass more smoothly across the surface, limiting turbulence that would otherwise create drag. This does not mean the form is sleek in the way of fast swimmers, but rather that it avoids unnecessary projections that catch and disrupt the current. Energy that might be lost in resisting water is conserved, redirected into controlled movement along the substrate. Sideways locomotion emerges within this framework as an efficient solution. The arrangement of joints and muscles allows for rapid lateral steps without requiring the body to pivot fully. This reduces the need for large adjustments in orientation, which would increase resistance and demand additional energy. Instead, movement occurs in short, controlled bursts, with the limbs pushing against the ground in a coordinated pattern that maintains stability while advancing position. This efficiency becomes more pronounced in environments where frequent adjustments are necessary. The ability to shift direction quickly without turning the entire body allows for precise navigation through uneven terrain. It also reduces the time spent in transitional movements, where the body might be more exposed or less stable. The structure supports both motion and stillness, allowing the animal to remain close to the ground while moving with minimal disruption. Beneath the outer form, the placement of vulnerable organs reflects another layer of adaptation. Internal systems are arranged within the protective boundaries of the body, shielded by a hardened exterior that absorbs and distributes external forces. This arrangement reduces the likelihood that critical structures will be directly impacted during encounters with predators or environmental stress. Protection is not achieved through speed alone, but through positioning and reinforcement. The abdomen, when extended, introduces a point of weakness. Its softer composition and protruding position make it more susceptible to damage. Exposure increases the chances of being grasped or injured, especially in environments where contact with other organisms or surfaces is frequent. By reducing and folding this structure beneath the body, its vulnerability decreases. It becomes integrated into the overall form, less accessible and better shielded. The upper shell plays a central role in this protective system. Its rigidity provides a barrier that can withstand pressure, dispersing force across a wider area rather than allowing it to concentrate at a single point. The curvature of this surface contributes to its strength, allowing it to resist deformation while maintaining a relatively low profile. This combination of strength and shape enhances both protection and interaction with surrounding forces. These features do not function in isolation. The hydrodynamic properties of the body, the mechanics of movement, and the arrangement of internal structures all reinforce one another. A compact form reduces drag, supports efficient locomotion, and protects vulnerable systems simultaneously. Each aspect contributes to a cohesive design that aligns with the physical realities of the environment. Over time, these advantages accumulate. Small differences in energy use, in resistance to force, and in protection can influence survival and reproduction. Lineages that align more closely with these conditions persist, while others gradually diminish. The result is a convergence toward forms that balance these physical demands, shaped not by intention, but by the consistent influence of the surrounding medium. Across long intervals of geological time, pressure did not remain constant. It intensified. New forms appeared that interacted with their surroundings in ways that altered the balance of survival. Among these changes was the rise of predators, capable of applying force not just to capture, but to break. Early marine ecosystems contained hunters that relied on speed or stealth, but as lineages diversified, others emerged with structures designed for crushing. Jaws thickened, muscles strengthened, and the ability to generate pressure increased. Fish developed biting mechanisms that could fracture hard surfaces, shifting from piercing or tearing toward direct compression. This change introduced a new kind of threat, one that did not depend on reaching vulnerable tissue, but on overcoming protective barriers entirely. In deeper time, marine reptiles moved through ancient seas, adding another layer to this pressure. Their size and strength extended the range of force that prey might encounter. With powerful jaws and controlled movement, they could seize and compress, testing the limits of any defensive structure. These interactions did not occur everywhere at once, but where they appeared, they altered the conditions under which smaller organisms persisted. For animals with exposed or lightly protected regions, this shift carried consequences. Structures that had once provided sufficient defense became liabilities under increased force. A long, unprotected abdomen, even if flexible and mobile, presented a point where pressure could be applied effectively. Once grasped, it offered little resistance, allowing predators to bypass other defenses and reach vital areas. In response, forms that concentrated protection gained an advantage. A hardened exterior that covered a larger portion of the body could distribute incoming force, reducing the likelihood of catastrophic failure. When that protective surface was continuous and closely integrated with the rest of the structure, it left fewer points where a predator could apply leverage. The body became not only shielded, but unified, resisting attempts to isolate and exploit weaker regions. Compactness reinforced this protection. By reducing extensions and bringing components inward, the body minimized areas that could be grasped or manipulated. Limbs remained functional, but the overall silhouette avoided unnecessary protrusions. The result was a form that could endure encounters with predators that relied on crushing force, not by escaping entirely, but by withstanding the initial impact long enough to persist. These changes did not occur in isolation. As predators adapted to overcome defenses, prey adapted in turn to resist them. This ongoing interaction formed a dynamic relationship, often described as an evolutionary arms race. Each adjustment on one side created pressure for a response on the other. Stronger jaws selected for tougher shells. More effective grasping selected for forms that were harder to hold. Within this exchange, the crab-like body aligns with a set of defensive strategies that address multiple aspects of predation. Its rigid exterior disperses force, its compact structure reduces vulnerability, and its organization limits the effectiveness of attacks aimed at specific regions. These traits do not guarantee survival, but they shift the balance, increasing the likelihood that an individual can endure an encounter. Over time, lineages that incorporated these features persisted under conditions where others declined. The repeated emergence of this form across separate groups reflects the consistency of the pressures involved. Where shell-crushing predators became part of the environment, similar responses appeared, shaped by the same fundamental interactions between force and resistance. The ocean, already defined by physical constraints, becomes further shaped by these biological exchanges. Predators and prey influence one another continuously, guiding the evolution of structure through a cycle of challenge and response that unfolds across deep time. Structures began to rise from the seafloor, slowly at first, then with increasing complexity, forming layered frameworks that altered the shape of entire ecosystems. Coral reefs expanded across shallow waters, building intricate networks of calcium carbonate that created a landscape unlike the open sediment around them. Instead of broad, continuous surfaces, the environment fractured into chambers, gaps, and narrow passages, each with its own boundaries. Within these formations, space became subdivided into countless small volumes. Open areas were limited, and much of the available shelter existed within tight crevices that extended only a short distance in any direction. Organisms that entered these spaces needed to match their dimensions closely. A body that exceeded the width of an opening could not pass through it, and one that extended too far in length could not fully conceal itself once inside. As reefs grew denser, competition for these spaces intensified. Multiple species converged on the same structures, each seeking protection or access to resources. The number of available crevices did not expand in proportion to the number of organisms that depended on them. This imbalance created pressure, favoring those whose forms allowed them to occupy and retain positions within these confined areas. Elongated bodies encountered limitations under these conditions. A long abdomen or extended rear section increased the likelihood of exposure even when part of the body was concealed. Sections that remained outside a crevice were accessible to predators or subject to environmental disturbance. Movement through narrow passages also became more difficult, requiring additional adjustments to align the body with the available space. In contrast, a compact form aligned more closely with the geometry of the reef. A shortened body could enter a crevice and fit within its boundaries more completely, reducing the amount of exposed surface. The ability to flatten against the substrate further enhanced this fit, allowing the organism to occupy spaces that were not only narrow, but also irregular in shape. Edges could press into contours, creating a closer match between body and environment. This alignment extended beyond simple concealment. A body that fit securely within a crevice could resist displacement more effectively. Water movement, redirected by the structure of the reef, created localized currents that passed through openings and around protrusions. Organisms that did not match the contours of these spaces risked being dislodged, while those that fit more precisely remained stable within them. Feeding opportunities also influence this pattern. Reefs support a wide range of organisms that produce particles, detritus, or small prey items. Access to these resources often occurs within confined spaces where water flow carries material through narrow channels. A compact body can position itself within these flows, interacting with the passing material while remaining partially sheltered. Extended forms may find it more difficult to maintain such positions without exposure. Over time, these combined pressures guide structural change. Lineages that can compress their bodies, reduce unnecessary extension, and align with the spatial constraints of the reef gain consistent advantages. Those that retain longer forms may persist in other environments, but within the reef itself, the balance shifts toward compactness. The result is a gradual filtering of forms, shaped by the architecture of the habitat. The reef does not impose a single outcome, but it narrows the range of viable structures. Within that narrowed range, similar solutions appear, each reflecting the same underlying constraints. The compact, flattened body becomes one of the most effective ways to exist within a world defined by tight spaces and constant competition. Time does not move evenly across the history of life. There are intervals of steady change, and then there are moments when continuity fractures, when entire systems collapse, and the structure of ecosystems dissolves into absence. During these intervals, diversity contracts sharply. Lineages that once filled every available space disappear, leaving behind a quieter world with fewer forms and fewer interactions. In the aftermath, the seafloor does not remain empty for long. Surviving organisms, those that endured the conditions of collapse, begin to expand into the spaces left behind. These spaces are not identical to what existed before. The architecture of the ecosystem has been altered, the balance between species reset. What remains is an open field of opportunity, shaped by absence as much as by presence. As these survivors diversify, they encounter environments that no longer contain the same competitors or predators. Niches that were once occupied now stand available, each representing a set of conditions that can be filled by whatever form is able to persist within it. This process, often described as adaptive radiation, unfolds gradually, with lineages branching outward into new roles. Small variations accumulate, guiding different groups toward different ways of interacting with their surroundings. Within this expansion, familiar structural patterns begin to appear again, not as remnants of what came before, but as new outcomes shaped by the same constraints that continue to operate. Among these patterns, the compact, flattened body emerges once more, formed within lineages that did not previously exhibit it. The conditions that favor such a structure remain present, even as the specific composition of the ecosystem has changed. Fossil records from periods following major extinction events reveal these repeated developments. In layers of sediment that mark the recovery phase, organisms begin to display features that align with the crab-like form. The timing of these appearances differs across regions and lineages, but the direction remains consistent. Separate groups, each responding to their own local conditions, move towards similar configurations. This repetition suggests that the forces shaping these outcomes persist beyond the disruptions that temporarily erase existing forms. The extinction event removes the current occupants of certain niches, but it does not remove the underlying constraints that define those niches. When new lineages expand into these spaces, they encounter the same pressures that once guided earlier transformations. The process is neither immediate nor uniform. Recovery unfolds over extended periods, with gradual increases in diversity and complexity. During this time, multiple structural experiments occur, some persisting, others fading. Among these, the crab-like structure appears repeatedly, not as a dominant form in every context, but as a recurring solution within specific environments. Each reappearance carries its own variations, shaped by the lineage in which it arises and the conditions of the moment. Yet the core features remain recognizable, reflecting the same balance between protection, stability, and interaction with the environment. The form does not replicate perfectly, but it converges toward a consistent arrangement. In this way, the pattern extends across cycles of collapse and recovery. The disappearance of previous forms does not prevent the reemergence of similar structures. Instead, It creates the conditions in which those structures can arise again, shaped by the same enduring constraints that continue to influence life in the ocean. Through these cycles, the history of the crab-like body becomes intertwined with the broader rhythm of extinction and renewal, appearing not once, but repeatedly as ecosystems rebuild themselves from absence. Two forms move through the same world, yet carry different geometries, one extended, the other drawn inward. The contrast is not merely visual but functional, shaped by how each body interacts with pressure, contact, and the need to persist within confined and shifting conditions. An elongated body distributes its length across multiple segments, creating flexibility and range. In open environments, this structure allows for controlled forward movement, with the abdomen contributing to propulsion and balance. The tail, composed of articulated segments, can generate force when needed, producing bursts of motion that carry the animal away from immediate disturbance. This design supports a style of locomotion that relies on extension and retraction, a sequence of movements that unfolds along the length of the body. Yet, this same extension introduces exposure. A long abdomen remains accessible, projecting beyond the protective coverage of the upper shell. Even when partially shielded, it cannot be fully enclosed without altering the entire structure. In environments where contact is frequent and space is limited, this projection becomes a point of interaction that cannot be easily concealed. It extends the boundary of the body into areas where force, grasp, or pressure can be applied. Mobility within confined spaces further reflects this difference. A longer form requires alignment before entering narrow passages, its segments needing to follow a specific orientation to pass through restricted openings. Adjustments take time and space, and any misalignment can prevent entry or create points of resistance. Once inside, turning or repositioning becomes more complex, as the entire length must be accommodated within the available volume. In contrast, a compact structure reduces these constraints. With less extension, the body can navigate tight environments with fewer adjustments, maintaining control while moving through irregular spaces. Directional changes occur without the need to reposition an extended tail, allowing for more immediate responses to shifts in the surroundings. The difference is not one of speed alone, but of adaptability within constrained geometries. Energy use follows a similar pattern. Maintaining a longer body involves sustaining more tissue, coordinating more segments, and managing movements that extend across a greater distance. Each motion engages multiple parts, distributing effort but also increasing the overall demand. In stable, open conditions, this cost may be balanced by the advantages of reach and propulsion. In environments where frequent adjustments are required, the cumulative demand can become significant. A shorter, more integrated body reduces these requirements. Movements involve fewer segments, and the coordination between parts is more direct. Energy that might be spent on managing extension can be conserved or redirected. Over time, small differences in efficiency can influence persistence, particularly in settings where resources are unevenly distributed or where movement must be repeated frequently. These contrasts do not render one form universally superior. Elongated bodies remain effective within contexts that support their strengths, especially where open space allows for full use of their range and propulsion. The divergence emerges when conditions favor compactness, protection, and stability within limited space. In those settings, the extended form encounters constraints that the compact form avoids. Across multiple lineages, these trade-offs shape the direction of change. Where environments impose limits on extension and reward reduced exposure, forms that compress and integrate gain a consistent advantage. The repeated emergence of compact bodies reflects this balance, not as a replacement of one design by another, but as a shift in which traits align more closely with prevailing conditions. Beneath the outer shell, a quiet shift in structure changes how the entire body holds itself together. The abdomen, once extended and flexible, begins to draw inward, folding beneath the main body until it becomes part of a tighter, more unified form. This movement does not simply hide a vulnerable region, it reshapes the balance of forces across the entire structure. When the abdomen remains extended, it introduces a division between the front and rear of the body. Each section moves with a degree of independence, connected but not fully integrated. Under pressure, this separation creates points where force can concentrate. A strike, a grasp, or even contact with uneven surfaces can act on the exposed section without being distributed evenly across the rest of the body. The result is a higher risk of localized damage. As the abdomen tucks inward, this division reduces. The body becomes more continuous, with fewer exposed joints and fewer transitions between rigid and flexible regions. The forces that act upon the exterior spread more evenly, moving across the hardened surfaces rather than concentrating on a single protruding segment. This redistribution enhances structural reinforcement, allowing the body to absorb impacts without failing at a specific point. Protection follows naturally from this integration. A folded abdomen lies beneath layers of more durable material, shielded by the surrounding structure. It is no longer easily accessible, no longer presented as an isolated target. Predatory interactions that depend on reaching softer areas encounter a barrier that is both physical and positional. The vulnerable region remains present, but it is embedded within a configuration that reduces its exposure. This inward folding also alters how the body interacts with movement through water. An extended abdomen disrupts flow, creating additional resistance as water moves around it. The separation between sections introduces irregularities that increase drag, requiring more energy to maintain position or adjust movement. When the abdomen is tucked, the outline becomes more compact, smoothing the interaction with surrounding currents. Water passes more evenly across the surface, reducing the effort required to remain stable or to move along the substrate. The shift in mass distribution further reinforces this change. With the abdomen drawn beneath the body, the center of mass moves closer to the middle, reducing imbalance between front and rear. This centralization stabilizes the body, making it less prone to tipping or rotating when external forces are applied. Movement becomes more controlled, with less energy needed to correct orientation after each adjustment. This compact center of mass supports both stillness and motion. When the body remains stationary, it resists displacement more effectively, maintaining contact with the surface beneath it. When movement occurs, the reduced imbalance allows for smoother transitions, with fewer oscillations or unintended shifts. The body responds as a single unit rather than as connected parts that must constantly adjust to one another. Over time, these advantages accumulate. Small improvements in resistance to force, in protection of vulnerable regions, and in efficiency of movement can influence survival across generations. Lineages that incorporate this inward folding gain a structural coherence that aligns with multiple demands at once. The tucked abdomen, though hidden from view, becomes one of the defining elements of the compact form. It is not a single adaptation acting in isolation, but a change that reshapes how the entire body distributes force, interacts with its environment, and maintains stability under constant pressure. Motion along the seafloor often appears subtle, a series of small shifts that keep the body close to the surface. In crab-like forms, this movement follows a direction that seems unusual at first glance, not forward in a straight line, but sideways, as if the body has chosen a different axis along which to travel. This direction is not arbitrary. It arises from how the limbs are arranged and how force is generated through them. Each walking leg extends outward from the sides of the body, connected through joints that favor lateral extension and retraction. The muscles that control these joints are organized to pull the limbs inward and push them outward in a horizontal plane. When these muscles contract in sequence, they produce movement that shifts the body from side to side rather than directly forward. The structure of the joints limits the range of forward motion while enabling efficient lateral displacement. This arrangement allows for rapid bursts of speed over short distances. When multiple legs push simultaneously, the body can accelerate quickly, covering ground in a brief, controlled surge. Because the limbs operate in parallel, rather than in a forward-stepping sequence, the transfer of force occurs across a wider base. This distributes effort and reduces the need for large, sweeping motions, keeping the body stable even during acceleration. Such bursts are particularly effective in environments where movement must be immediate. A sudden shift in position can create distance between the animal and a source of disturbance. The sideways direction offers flexibility, allowing movement in multiple directions without requiring a full reorientation of the body. By adjusting the sequence of leg movements, the animal can change its path while maintaining the same general posture. This flexibility extends to how escape trajectories are formed. Movement does not depend on aligning the body toward a single forward direction. Instead, the body remains oriented as it is, while the legs generate motion that carries it along a chosen path. This reduces the time needed to respond, as no preliminary rotation is required before movement begins. The result is a system that favors immediacy and adaptability. Within confined environments, this mode of locomotion becomes even more advantageous. Narrow passages and irregular surfaces limit the space available for turning or extending the body. Sideways movement allows the animal to navigate these constraints without needing to reposition its entire form. The limbs adjust to the available space, stepping along edges and surfaces while the body maintains a consistent orientation. Energy efficiency plays a role in this as well. By keeping movements small and coordinated, the animal minimizes unnecessary displacement. Each step contributes directly to movement, with little wasted motion. The lateral arrangement of the limbs supports this efficiency, as force is applied in a direction that aligns with the intended path, reducing the need for corrective adjustments. The overall effect is a form of locomotion that integrates with the compact structure of the body. Movement remains close to the surface, controlled and responsive, shaped by the same constraints that influence the body's form. Sideways walking is not a deviation from an expected pattern, but a natural outcome of the underlying mechanics. Over time, this mode of movement becomes part of the broader alignment between structure and environment. It supports the ability to remain stable, to navigate confined spaces, and to respond quickly to changes. Within the context of repeated structural convergence, it reflects another dimension in which similar solutions arise, shaped by consistent physical and biological pressures. Before the final form settles into its compact outline, the body passes through stages that bear little resemblance to what it will become. Early in life, the organism drifts or moves with a structure that is more extended, its proportions reflecting an ancestral arrangement that has not yet been reshaped. These larval stages carry the basic plan, but not the finished configuration. As development progresses, changes unfold gradually, guided by internal processes that adjust how segments grow, how tissues differentiate, and how proportions shift. The transformation does not occur as a single event. It emerges through a sequence of modifications, each altering a small aspect of the body. Segments that once extended outward begin to reduce in length. Regions that were distinct start to integrate more closely. The overall form moves toward a configuration that is more compact and cohesive. At the core of these changes are genetic mechanisms that regulate development. Within the organism, sets of genes control how the body is partitioned into segments and how each segment contributes to the final structure. These genes do not operate in isolation. They interact in networks, turning on and off at specific times, guiding the growth of tissues in precise patterns. Small variations in these regulatory processes can lead to noticeable differences in how the body develops. For example, a slight shift in the timing of gene expression can alter the length of a segment or the degree to which it folds or integrates with neighboring regions. Over many generations, such shifts can accumulate, gradually changing the proportions of the body. What begins as a minor adjustment in development can, when repeated and reinforced, lead to a significant transformation in the adult form. The folding of the abdomen illustrates this process clearly. In early stages, the abdomen may remain extended, reflecting its ancestral condition. As development continues, the mechanisms that control segmentation and growth begin to favor reduction and inward movement. The tissues reorganize, the segments compress, and the abdomen becomes incorporated beneath the body. This change is not imposed from outside, but arises from alterations in the developmental program itself. Similar processes influence other aspects of the body. The expansion of the upper surface, the repositioning of limbs, and the integration of different regions all emerge from coordinated changes in gene activity. Each adjustment builds upon the previous one, creating a cumulative effect that reshapes the entire organism. The final structure appears cohesive, but it is the result of many small steps, each guided by internal regulation. These developmental pathways are not fixed. They retain a degree of flexibility, allowing variation to occur. When environmental pressures favor certain structural outcomes, variations that align with those outcomes are more likely to persist. Over time, the developmental processes themselves can evolve, becoming more consistent in producing the favored form. This connection between development and evolution creates a bridge between small changes and large results. Alterations at the level of gene regulation, often subtle and gradual, can lead to significant differences in adult structure. The body does not need to be redesigned entirely. It can be reshaped by adjusting how existing parts grow and integrate. Through this lens, the repeated emergence of similar forms becomes more understandable. Different lineages, each with their own developmental pathways, can arrive at comparable outcomes by modifying similar aspects of their growth. The convergence occurs not only in the final structure, but in the processes that guide its formation, where small shifts in development accumulate into a shared pattern across different branches of life. Forms appear that echo one another without sharing a recent origin, as if certain solutions arise whenever similar conditions persist. The pattern seen in crab-like bodies is not isolated. It belongs to a broader tendency in which unrelated lineages arrive at comparable structures when shaped by the same constraints. In open water, streamlined bodies emerge in animals separated by vast evolutionary distance. Sharks, built upon a framework of cartilage, move with a form that narrows at both ends, reducing resistance as they pass through the surrounding medium. Dolphins, mammals that return to the ocean long after their ancestors lived on land, display a remarkably similar outline. Their internal anatomy differs. Their ancestry traces a separate path, yet their external form converges toward the same efficient shape. The water imposes limits, and within those limits, certain configurations perform consistently well. A similar repetition appears in the development of vision. In different groups, complex eyes have formed independently, each capable of focusing light and resolving detail. The underlying structures vary, with differences in how cells are arranged and how signals are processed, yet the overall function aligns. The eye becomes a lens through which the environment is interpreted, shaped by the same need to detect light and form images. Separate evolutionary paths produce comparable solutions because the problem they address remains the same. These patterns extend across environments and scales. Wings in birds and bats, though constructed from different skeletal elements, serve the same purpose and share similar aerodynamic properties. Plant forms in arid regions often display comparable adaptations, reducing water loss through structures that arise independently in different lineages. Each case reflects a convergence driven by shared pressures rather than shared ancestry. The repetition does not imply a predetermined outcome, but it suggests that the range of effective solutions is narrower than the range of possible forms. When physical laws and environmental conditions define the boundaries within which organisms operate, certain designs become more viable than others. Over time, lineages that approach these designs persist, while those that diverge too far from them encounter greater challenges. Within this framework, convergence becomes a natural result of constraint. Different starting points can lead towards similar endpoints when guided by the same influences. The process unfolds gradually, with small variations accumulating until the overall structure aligns with a functional solution. The similarities that emerge are not exact replicas, but they are close enough to reveal a shared response to common conditions. In the case of crab-like bodies, the convergence reflects a combination of factors that consistently favor compactness, protection, and stability. Other lineages, facing analogous pressures, arrive at comparable forms through their own developmental pathways. The repetition becomes visible not as coincidence, but as a pattern that reflects the interaction between biology and the physical world. This perspective shifts how similarity is interpreted. Instead of indicating direct relation, resemblance can signal a shared response to similar challenges. The outward form becomes a record of pressures encountered and resolved, rather than a simple reflection of lineage. Across the diversity of life, these recurring solutions trace a quiet continuity, linking distant organisms through the constraints that shape them. The same conditions, encountered in different times and places, guide separate histories toward forms that align with the limits and possibilities of their environment. Geometry quietly governs how a body holds itself against the forces that surround it. Beneath the surface of muscle and shell, there is an arrangement of lines, angles, and curves that determines how pressure moves through the structure. The crab-like form reflects a configuration in which these elements align towards stability, distributing force in a way that reduces vulnerability. A broad, flattened shape lowers the vertical profile of the body, bringing it closer to the surface beneath it. This reduction in height alters how external forces interact with the structure. When force is applied from above or from the side, the distance between the point of contact and the base remains small, limiting the leverage that can be generated. With less leverage, there is less tendency for the body to tip or rotate. Stability emerges not from resistance alone, but from the geometry that reduces the effect of applied force. The distribution of mass across a wider area further reinforces this effect. Weight is not concentrated at a single point, but spread outward, creating multiple points of contact with the substrate. Each point shares the load, reducing stress on any individual area. This distribution allows the body to maintain balance even when the surface beneath it is uneven. Small variations in terrain do not destabilize the structure, as the load adjusts across the available contact points. Curvature plays a role in how the outer shell manages incoming force. A slightly arched surface can redirect pressure, spreading it across a broader region rather than allowing it to focus at one location. This principle, observed in many natural and engineered forms, increases the strength of the structure without requiring additional material. The shell becomes both protective and efficient, shaped to handle force through its geometry as much as through its composition. Edges and joints are areas where weakness can emerge if not integrated carefully. In a more extended body, transitions between segments create points where force can concentrate, leading to potential failure under stress. In a compact form, these transitions are reduced or repositioned, allowing the outer structure to act more as a continuous surface. Fewer exposed joints mean fewer locations where stress can accumulate disproportionately. The minimization of protrusions contributes to this continuity. When limbs and other extensions remain close to the body, they reduce the number of points where force can be applied independently. A protruding element can act as a lever, amplifying the effect of an external force on the rest of the structure. By keeping these elements integrated and aligned with the main body, the structure avoids creating such leverage points. Internal organization mirrors this external geometry. The arrangement of tissues and supporting structures follows patterns that distribute internal loads evenly. When the body encounters pressure, both external and internal components respond in a coordinated manner, maintaining integrity across the entire system. This coordination reduces the likelihood that a single point of failure will compromise the whole. Over time, these geometric advantages influence which forms persist. Structures that manage force efficiently require less reinforcement and experience fewer failures, allowing them to maintain function under a range of conditions. Lineages that approach these configurations gain a consistent benefit, not through any single trait, but through the combined effect of multiple geometric relationships. Within this framework, the crab-like body represents a solution that aligns closely with the principles of stability and load distribution. Its compactness reduces weak points, its shape disperses force, and its structure integrates components into a cohesive whole. These properties emerge not from deliberate design, but from the consistent influence of physical laws acting over long periods, guiding form toward configurations that endure far below the reach of sunlight. Where the water grows cold and still, the seafloor changes again. Light fades to absence, temperature drops toward near freezing, and pressure increases with every descending meter. In this environment, life persists under conditions that differ sharply from those above, yet familiar shapes continue to appear within the darkness. Crab-like forms exist here as well, adapted to depths where the surrounding water presses inward with constant force. The compact body, already suited to managing external pressure, aligns naturally with these conditions. A structure that distributes force evenly across its surface resists deformation more effectively than one with extended or uneven features. The hardened exterior provides stability, maintaining shape despite the immense pressure that surrounds it. Cold water influences movement and metabolism. Chemical processes slow, reducing the rate at which energy is used and generated. In response, many deep-sea organisms adopt a pace that reflects this environment, conserving energy through measured, deliberate motion. The compact form supports this efficiency, requiring less energy to maintain and move compared to more extended structures. Each movement becomes economical, aligned with the limited availability of resources. In the absence of light, visual cues diminish, and other senses take precedence. Structures that extend outward may provide sensory advantages, but they also introduce exposure and increase the cost of maintaining additional tissue. A more integrated body reduces these demands, allowing energy to be directed toward functions that support survival in a resource-limited setting. The crab-like shape, with its balance between protection and efficiency, fits within these constraints. Some deep-sea species exhibit a phenomenon often referred to as gigantism. Individuals grow larger than their counterparts in shallower waters, a pattern observed across multiple groups. The reasons for this increase in size involve complex interactions between temperature, metabolism, and ecological factors. In cold environments, slower metabolic rates can support longer lifespans, allowing organisms to grow over extended periods. Reduced predation pressure in certain regions may also contribute, permitting larger sizes to persist. Within this context, the crab-like form scales upward while maintaining its structural advantages. The broad surface distributes weight, and the integrated body supports stability even as size increases. Larger forms interact with the environment differently, but the underlying geometry remains effective, continuing to manage pressure and maintain balance. Darkness shapes behavior as well. Without reliance on vision, movement becomes guided by touch, chemical signals, and subtle changes in the surrounding water. A compact body allows for closer interaction with the substrate, where many of these cues originate. Limbs extend just enough to explore and respond without creating unnecessary exposure. Reproduction and development in these depths follow patterns adapted to limited resources and low temperatures. Growth may proceed slowly with extended developmental stages that reflect the environment's pace. The resulting forms emerge fully suited to their conditions, carrying the same compact structure that has appeared in other settings, now adjusted to the unique demands of the deep sea. Across these extreme conditions, the repetition of the crab-like form continues. It appears not as an isolated adaptation to shallow or crowded environments, but as a structure capable of functioning under a wide range of pressures. From illuminated coastal regions to the dark expanses of the deep ocean, the same general configuration persists, shaped by the physical and biological constraints that define each setting. Between land and open water lies a narrow band where conditions shift with a steady rhythm. The tide advances and retreats, covering and uncovering the same ground in cycles that reshape the environment hour by hour. In this zone, organisms experience both immersion and exposure, moving between water and air without leaving their position. As the tide rises, the area fills with water, bringing currents, suspended particles, and the presence of other marine life. When it falls, surfaces that were submerged become exposed to air, temperature changes, and direct contact with the atmosphere. This alternation creates a setting where stability depends on the ability to endure rapid transitions. Wave action adds another layer of force. Water driven by wind and distant motion breaks against the shoreline, transferring energy into the intertidal zone. Each impact generates turbulence, pushing and pulling at anything within reach. The direction and intensity of these forces vary, but their presence is continuous. Structures that cannot withstand repeated impact, risk, displacement, or damage. Within this environment, the compact, flattened body provides a consistent advantage. By remaining close to the surface, it reduces the effect of incoming waves, allowing water to pass over rather than lift or roll the organism. The distribution of weight across a broad area increases contact with the substrate, enhancing grip without the need for permanent attachment. Even when water surges, the body maintains its position through its form. Air exposure introduces different challenges. When water recedes, moisture begins to evaporate, and temperature can fluctuate more widely than in submerged conditions. Surfaces that were once buffered by water become subject to direct heating or cooling. Organisms must retain internal balance despite these changes, preventing excessive water loss while maintaining function. The hardened exterior plays a role here as well. It limits the rate at which moisture escapes, creating a barrier that slows evaporation. Openings remain controlled, allowing necessary exchange while minimizing exposure. The compact arrangement of the body reduces surface area relative to volume, further aiding in the retention of internal conditions during periods out of water. Movement within this shifting environment requires flexibility, the ability to reposition quickly, to move between submerged and exposed areas, or to seek shelter within available spaces becomes important. The lateral motion supported by the body's structure allows for these adjustments without requiring extensive reorientation. The organism can navigate uneven surfaces and respond to changing conditions while maintaining stability. Feeding opportunities also fluctuate with the tide. As water flows in and out, it carries organic material, small organisms, and other resources across the substrate. A body positioned close to the surface can interact with this flow, accessing food during both submerged and partially exposed phases. The compact form supports this interaction, allowing the organism to remain in place while conditions change around it. Over time, these combined pressures shape which forms persist in the intertidal zone. Structures that can endure repeated immersion, resist wave impact, and tolerate exposure to air gain and advantage. The crab-like body aligns with these demands, not through a single feature, but through the integration of multiple traits that support stability, protection, and efficiency. In this narrow band between two worlds, the repetition of such forms continues, reflecting the consistency of the forces that define the environment and the responses that allow life to remain within it. Across the seafloor, energy does not arrive in steady streams. It appears in fragments, drifting, settling, or passing briefly through the environment before dispersing. In such conditions, survival depends not only on strength or speed, but on the ability to make use of whatever resources become available, often without warning or predictability. The compact body aligns closely with this pattern of uneven supply. Positioned low against the substrate, it remains in constant proximity to where material accumulates. Organic particles settle downward, fragments of once living matter gather in depressions, and small organisms move along the same surfaces. A body that stays close to these layers can access them directly, without the need for extended pursuit or vertical movement. Feeding in this context becomes versatile. Rather than relying on a single source, the organism can shift between different types of intake, responding to what is present at a given moment. Detritus, small invertebrates, or fragments carried by currents can all serve as nourishment. The front limbs, shaped to grasp and manipulate, allow for interaction with a range of materials, sorting and consuming what can be processed. This flexibility reduces dependence on any one resource. When one source becomes scarce, others may still be available, allowing the organism to continue functioning without significant interruption. Over time, this adaptability supports persistence in environments where conditions fluctuate and where specialized feeding strategies may fail. Scavenging becomes a particularly effective approach under these circumstances. Material that has already been processed by other organisms, or that has settled after passing through the water column, represents an accessible form of energy. It does not require active hunting, only the ability to locate and utilize what is already present. A body that can remain stable while interacting with the substrate is well suited to this role. The compact structure supports this interaction by maintaining close contact with the surface while allowing precise movements of the limbs. The organism can remain in place, conserving energy, while still engaging with passing or settled material. This reduces the need for extensive travel, limiting energy expenditure while maximizing intake from the immediate surroundings. Movement, when it occurs, is often brief and targeted. Rather than continuous motion, the organism shifts position only when necessary, relocating to areas where resources are more abundant or conditions more favorable. This pattern conserves energy, aligning activity with opportunity rather than maintaining constant effort. Over extended periods, such efficiency influences survival. In environments where resources are unevenly distributed, those that can minimize expenditure while maintaining intake gain an advantage. The balance between energy gained and energy used becomes a defining factor, shaping which forms persist. The crab-like body reflects this balance through its integration of structure and function. Its position near the substrate, its ability to interact with varied materials, and its capacity for controlled movement all contribute to an efficient use of available energy. These traits do not operate independently, but together form a system that aligns with the conditions of the seafloor. Within this system, opportunistic survival emerges not as a single behavior, but as a continuous adjustment to the surrounding environment. The organism does not depend on a fixed pattern of intake. Instead, it responds to what is present, using its structure to engage with a range of possibilities. As these patterns repeat across different lineages, the compact form appears again, shaped by the same need to balance energy intake with expenditure in a world where resources arrive without certainty. Not every lineage follows the same narrowing path. Even as compact forms appear repeatedly across the seafloor, other groups persist with bodies that remain extended, streamlined, or built for continuous motion through open water. Their structures reflect a different set of demands, shaped by environments where flattening and compression offer fewer advantages. In the water column, away from the substrate, space expands in all directions. Movement is not constrained by surfaces or crevices, and stability depends less on contact with the ground and more on control within a three-dimensional fluid. In this setting, propulsion becomes central. Bodies that can generate forward thrust efficiently gain access to resources that drift or swim through open space. Length and flexibility contribute to this function, allowing the organism to move in sustained, directed paths. Pelagic lifestyles emphasize continuous motion. Rather than remaining in one place and interacting with passing material, these organisms travel through the water, encountering food and avoiding threats through movement. An elongated body supports this pattern, distributing propulsion along its length and allowing for smoother, more sustained swimming. Compression into a compact form would reduce this efficiency, limiting the ability to move effectively through open water. Swimming specialists refine this further. Their limbs or appendages adapt into structures that generate thrust or control direction, often extending outward or backward to interact with the surrounding fluid. These adaptations require space to operate. A flattened, inward-focused body would restrict the range of motion needed for effective propulsion. In this context, extension is not a liability, but a necessity. The distribution of mass also differs in these environments. In open water, balance is achieved through buoyancy and controlled movement, rather than through a low center of gravity against a surface. A more evenly distributed body can maintain orientation while moving, adjusting position through subtle changes in limb motion or body curvature. The compact arrangement that benefits stability on the seafloor does not provide the same advantage here. Feeding strategies further influence these differences. Organisms that capture prey in open water often rely on speed, reach, or specialized appendages that extend beyond the main body. These features allow them to intercept moving targets or filter material from the surrounding fluid. A compressed form would limit this reach, reducing the ability to interact with resources that are not confined to a surface. Trade-offs emerge as these different requirements shape structure. A body optimized for stability and protection in confined spaces sacrifices some of the capabilities needed for sustained swimming and extended reach. Conversely, a body designed for movement through open water may retain vulnerabilities that would be disadvantageous on the seafloor. Each form aligns with a particular set of conditions, and the advantages of one do not necessarily transfer to another. Within this diversity, the absence of crab-like forms in certain lineages reflects the boundaries imposed by their ecological roles. Evolution does not move uniformly toward a single outcome. It explores multiple pathways, each constrained by the environment in which a lineage exists and the functions it must perform. The repeated emergence of compact bodies in some settings coexists with the persistence of extended forms in others. Together, they illustrate how different pressures guide structure in different directions, producing a range of solutions rather than a single dominant design. From a distance, repeated forms can appear as if they are being approached deliberately, as though life is moving toward a preferred design. The recurrence of similar structures across separate lineages creates a sense of direction, a quiet impression that outcomes are being aimed for rather than arrived at. Yet within the processes that shape living systems, there is no guiding intention, no endpoint held in advance. Natural selection operates through variation and filtering. Small differences arise within populations, and those that align more closely with current conditions tend to persist. Others diminish, not through judgment, but through the cumulative effect of interactions that favor some configurations over others. This process unfolds continuously, without foresight, responding only to what exists in each moment. The appearance of direction emerges from the consistency of these conditions. When similar pressures act across different environments and times, they shape outcomes in comparable ways. The repetition of form reflects the repetition of constraint, not the presence of a goal. What seems like a path toward a specific structure is, in reality, a series of responses to forces that narrow the range of viable possibilities. This distinction becomes clearer when considering how variation occurs. Changes do not arise in order to solve a problem. They appear through shifts in development, through genetic differences that have no inherent awareness of their effects. Only after these variations interact with the environment does their significance become apparent. Those that function effectively remain, while others fade. The resulting pattern can resemble intention because it produces coherence. Independent lineages, encountering similar challenges, arrive at forms that appear coordinated, as if guided by a shared plan. Yet each lineage moves through its own sequence of changes, shaped by local conditions and its own history. The alignment between them is not imposed, but emerges from the common structure of the challenges they face. Constraints play a central role in this process. Physical laws, environmental conditions, and biological interactions define the boundaries within which variation can persist. These boundaries do not dictate a single outcome, but they limit the range of forms that can function effectively. Within this limited space, certain configurations become more likely, not because they are intended, but because they fit within the constraints more closely than alternatives. Over time, these constraints guide the accumulation of changes. The direction that appears is a byproduct of this guidance, a pattern that reflects the narrowing of possibilities rather than a movement toward a predetermined end. Each step remains contingent, dependent on the variations available and the conditions present at that moment. The repeated emergence of compact, stable forms illustrates this principle. Multiple lineages, each beginning from different starting points, encounter similar constraints and respond through gradual change. The resulting similarity suggests a shared direction, yet it arises from independent processes shaped by the same boundaries. Understanding this distinction shifts the interpretation of repetition. What might be seen as purpose becomes a reflection of constraint. The consistency of the outcome does not imply a guiding force, but reveals how strongly certain conditions influence form. In this way, the pattern persists without intention, shaped by processes that operate locally and continuously. The forms that appear are not chosen in advance, but emerge through the interaction between variation and the limits imposed by the environment. Possibility, when imagined in abstraction, appears unbounded, as though life could assume any form given enough time. Yet, within the medium of water, and within the materials that living bodies are built from, limits quietly define what can persist. These limits do not announce themselves directly, but they shape outcomes by narrowing the range of structures that remain stable, efficient, and functional. Water imposes constraints through its density and movement. It resists motion, presses against surfaces, and transmits force in ways that influence how bodies interact with it. A shape that extends too far in one direction encounters increased resistance, requiring greater energy to maintain position or to move. A structure that rises too high above the substrate becomes more exposed to the forces carried by currents, increasing the likelihood of displacement. These interactions set boundaries on how far certain forms can diverge from configurations that balance resistance and stability. Material properties add another layer to these constraints. Biological tissues, even when reinforced, have limits to their strength and flexibility. A structure cannot grow indefinitely in one dimension without introducing points of weakness. As length increases, the forces acting on that length also increase, placing stress on connections between segments. Without sufficient support, these stresses can lead to deformation or failure. Compact arrangements reduce these stresses by shortening distances and distributing force more evenly. The concept of structural ceilings emerges from this interplay. Certain designs approach the limits of what the materials and environment can support. Beyond these limits, additional variation becomes less viable. Forms that exceed these boundaries may arise briefly, but they are less likely to persist over time. The range of successful structures becomes confined within a space defined by both physical laws and biological capabilities. Within this confined space, not every imaginable shape can exist. Some configurations would require materials stronger than those available, or energy inputs beyond what the environment can provide. Others would interact with water in ways that produce instability, making sustained function difficult. The absence of these forms is not due to lack of possibility in theory, but to the constraints that operate in practice. Evolution explores variation within these limits, adjusting proportions, integrating structures, and refining functions. The diversity that emerges is broad, yet it remains bounded. Similar pressures guide different lineages toward regions of this space, where forms are both stable and efficient. When multiple paths lead into the same region, convergence occurs, producing similar structures from separate origins. The repeated appearance of compact, flattened bodies reflects this bounded exploration. These forms occupy a region where stability, protection, and efficient interaction with the environment align. Other regions remain occupied by different structures, each suited to its own set of conditions. The overall diversity of life becomes a map of these regions, each defined by the constraints that shape it. Understanding these limits reframes how variation is perceived. Instead of an infinite landscape of possible forms, there is a structured space in which certain configurations are more accessible and more sustainable. Evolution does not move freely across all possibilities, but navigates within this space, guided by the boundaries that define it. In this context, the recurrence of particular shapes becomes less surprising. It reflects the tendency of different lineages to move towards similar regions of structural viability, shaped by the same physical and biological constraints that govern all forms within the ocean. In quiet corners of the present ocean, change continues without announcement. Lineages persist, reproduce, and vary in small ways that rarely draw attention, yet these variations accumulate, shaped by the same kinds of pressures that have operated across deep time. The forms visible today are not fixed endpoints, but temporary arrangements within an ongoing process. Among crustaceans, diversity remains wide. Some retain elongated bodies, others display intermediate structures, and many already carry the compact forms that have appeared repeatedly in the past. Within these populations, variation continues at the level of development and structure. Slight differences in growth patterns, proportions, and behavior introduce subtle shifts that may, over generations, influence how these organisms interact with their environments. Environmental pressures have not disappeared. The seafloor remains a space of contact, competition, and uneven resource distribution. Currents continue to move across it, predators continue to apply force, and available shelter remains limited in many regions. These conditions, though altered in detail by changing climates and ecosystems, still impose constraints that favor certain structural responses over others. At the same time, new influences have emerged. Changes in temperature, chemistry, and habitat structure modify the context in which organisms develop and persist. These shifts do not remove the underlying physical principles, but they adjust the balance of pressures that guide variation. Some environments become more favorable to certain forms, while others place new demands on existing structures. Within this shifting landscape, the possibility of repeated transformation remains. If a lineage carries the capacity for variation in the aspects of development that influence body shape, and if the surrounding conditions favor a more compact and integrated form, gradual changes can accumulate in that direction. The process does not require a return to a previous state, but it can produce outcomes that resemble those seen before, shaped by similar constraints. Timescale plays a central role in this unfolding. The changes that lead to significant structural transformation occur over many generations, often beyond direct observation. What appears static within a single lifespan may, across extended periods, reveal a steady progression. Fossil records capture fragments of such changes, but much of the process remains continuous and unrecorded in detail. In present populations, early stages of variation may already exist, expressed as slight differences in proportion or behavior that align more closely with certain environmental conditions. These differences, if they provide even a small advantage, can become more common over time. The direction of change remains contingent, dependent on the interaction between variation and the pressures acting upon it. The repetition of compact forms in the past suggests that certain configurations remain accessible within the space of possible structures. As long as the constraints that favor these configurations persist, the pathways that lead toward them remain open. The outcome is not predetermined, but it is not entirely unpredictable either. Within the ongoing movement of life, patterns can reappear when conditions align. The same balance between protection, stability, and efficiency that has shaped forms before continues to influence what can persist. Over long intervals, these influences can guide separate lineages towards similar results, not as a repetition of history, but as a continuation of the processes that produced it. A pattern repeated enough times begins to feel familiar, and familiarity often carries a quiet sense of meaning. When similar forms appear across distant lineages, separated by time and origin, the mind tends to draw them together, arranging them into a single narrative that feels directed. This response arises not from the pattern itself, but from how perception organizes what it observes. Human cognition is tuned to recognize structure. It searches for regularities, grouping similar elements and tracing connections between them. This ability supports understanding in many contexts, allowing complex information to be reduced into coherent forms. Yet the same tendency can extend beyond what is present, adding a sense of intention where only repetition exists. When a form appears once, it can be treated as an isolated occurrence. When it appears again, and then again, the repetition suggests a deeper link. The mind begins to interpret the pattern as a trajectory, as though each instance is part of a sequence leading toward a common outcome. This interpretation introduces a sense of direction, even when the underlying processes remain independent. The impression of destiny grows from this accumulation. Repeated outcomes begin to resemble a goal, not because one is guiding them, but because the pattern aligns closely enough to suggest coordination. Similar shapes, similar functions, and similar structures create a visual and conceptual unity that feels deliberate. The boundaries between separate histories blur, replaced by a single, imagined path. Cognitive biases contribute to this effect. Pattern recognition operates quickly, often preceding deeper analysis. Once a pattern is perceived, it becomes easier to notice additional examples that reinforce it, while instances that do not fit as neatly may receive less attention. This selective reinforcement strengthens the impression of consistency, making the pattern appear more pervasive and more intentional than it may be. Another aspect of perception involves the tendency to attribute purpose to outcomes. When a structure appears well suited to its environment, it can seem as though it was designed for that role. The alignment between form and function feels precise, encouraging the interpretation that the outcome was anticipated or directed. In reality, this alignment emerges from the filtering of variation, where forms that function effectively persist and those that do not gradually diminish. These cognitive processes operate continuously, shaping how patterns are understood. They do not create the patterns themselves, but they influence how those patterns are interpreted. The repetition of similar forms across separate lineages remains a real and measurable phenomenon. The sense of intention attached to it arises from the way perception organizes and extends that observation. Within this framework, The crab-like form becomes more than a structural outcome. It becomes a symbol of repetition, a focal point around which interpretations of direction and purpose gather. The clarity of its shape and the frequency of its appearance make it especially susceptible to this kind of interpretation. Recognizing this tendency does not diminish the pattern. It clarifies the distinction between what is observed and how it is understood. The recurrence remains, shaped by consistent pressures and constraints. The sense of destiny emerges as a layer added by perception, reflecting the mind's inclination to find coherence within repetition. In this quiet interplay between observation and interpretation, the pattern persists, while the meaning assigned to it continues to evolve alongside the way it is perceived. Across long intervals, the ocean does not simply host life, it refines it. Conditions shift, forces persist, and within this continuity, variation encounters a process that gradually separates what endures from what does not. The result is not immediate or visible in a single moment, but it accumulates, shaping the forms that remain. Each generation carries small differences, subtle variations in structure, proportion, and behavior. These differences enter an environment where physical forces, resource distribution, and interactions with other organisms apply consistent pressure. The environment does not select with intention, but it acts as a filter, allowing certain configurations to persist while others diminish. Forms that require more energy than the environment can provide begin to fall away. Structures that expose vulnerable regions without sufficient protection encounter repeated stress, reducing their persistence over time. Designs that interact poorly with movement and water, or that fail to maintain stability under changing conditions, gradually become less common. These outcomes are not abrupt, but unfold through cumulative effects where small disadvantages compound across generations. At the same time, forms that align more closely with the constraints of the environment continue. Their structures manage force more effectively, their energy use remains balanced, and their interactions with the surrounding conditions support ongoing survival. These forms do not dominate immediately, but they persist with greater consistency, gradually becoming more representative within their populations. This process resembles a sieve through which variation passes. The openings are defined by the constraints of the environment, and only those configurations that fit within these limits continue. The filtering is continuous, operating at every stage of life, from development through reproduction. Over extended periods, the accumulation of these selections shapes the overall structure of the population. Within this filtered space, different lineages may begin from distinct origins, carrying their own variations and histories. As they pass through the same environmental constraints, their forms begin to align in certain ways, not because they share ancestry in recent time, but because the same pressures guide their variation towards similar regions of structural viability. Inefficient forms do not disappear instantly. They may persist for a time, occupying niches where their limitations are less pronounced. Yet as conditions shift or as competition increases, their disadvantages become more apparent. Over time, these forms contribute less to future generations, their presence diminishing as other configurations take hold. The convergence that emerges from this process is gradual and cumulative. It reflects the narrowing of possibilities as variation passes repeatedly through the same filter. Each cycle of selection refines the range of forms, reducing divergence in certain aspects while maintaining diversity in others. The resulting patterns carry the imprint of the constraints that shape them. Within this context, the repeated appearance of compact, stable structures becomes an expected outcome of sustained filtering. The environment does not direct lineages toward a specific form, but it consistently favors configurations that align with its conditions. As different lineages encounter these same conditions, their forms begin to resemble one another. The ocean, in this sense, acts not as a passive setting, but as an active medium, through which variation is continuously shaped. Its pressures, both physical and biological, define the boundaries within which life persists. Over time, these boundaries guide the emergence of forms that reflect the constraints they impose, producing patterns that repeat across separate histories. Limits do not announce themselves with force. They accumulate quietly, shaping outcomes by reducing what remains possible. Across time, the environment applies these limits continuously, not by directing change toward a specific form, but by narrowing the range within which change can persist. What begins as wide variation gradually settles into a smaller set of viable arrangements. Each lineage carries its own starting point, its own inherited structure and developmental pathways. From these beginnings, variation emerges, introducing differences in proportion, movement, and interaction with the surrounding world. Yet these differences do not unfold in isolation. They enter conditions that define what can be sustained, filtering possibilities through the demands of physical forces, available resources, and interactions with other forms of life. The narrowing is subtle. It does not remove all alternatives at once, but gradually reduces those that fall outside the boundaries of effective function. A structure that requires more energy than can be consistently obtained becomes less common. A form that fails to maintain stability under recurring forces loses its presence over time. These outcomes accumulate across generations, shaping the overall direction of change without imposing a specific destination. Within this reduced space, evolution continues to explore. Variation does not cease. It moves within the limits that remain. Small adjustments refine existing structures, shifting them slightly closer to configurations that align with the constraints. These adjustments build upon one another, creating a sense of continuity even as the underlying possibilities have been quietly reduced. The design space, once broad, becomes structured. It contains regions where forms are more stable, more efficient, and more likely to persist. Lineages that move into these regions find conditions that support their continuation, while those that remain outside encounter increasing difficulty. The result is a concentration of forms within certain areas of this space, reflecting the influence of the constraints that define it. Different lineages may approach these regions from separate directions. Their histories diverge, their developmental pathways differ, yet the constraints they encounter guide them towards similar configurations. The convergence that emerges is not a coincidence, but a reflection of how limited the viable regions of the design space can be under consistent conditions. The process does not eliminate diversity entirely. Within each region, variation continues, producing a range of forms that share certain structural features while differing in detail. These variations allow lineages to occupy slightly different roles, interacting with their environment in distinct ways while remaining within the same general boundaries. Over extended periods, the quiet power of constraints becomes more apparent. Patterns that might seem unlikely at first glance reveal themselves as natural outcomes of sustained filtering. The repetition of certain structures reflects the narrowing of possibilities, not the presence of an external guiding force. In this context, evolution appears less like an open exploration of infinite forms and more like a movement within a landscape shaped by limits. The paths available are defined by what can function within the environment, and the forms that emerge reflect the contours of that landscape. Through this continuous interaction between variation and constraint, the diversity of life takes shape, guided not by intention, but by the boundaries that quietly define what is possible. Across the long arc of life, patterns emerge not as isolated events, but as reflections of deeper regularities. When similar forms appear again and again, shaped by separate histories, they reveal something about the conditions that govern existence itself. The repetition of compact, stable bodies points beyond individual lineages toward the forces that act on all living systems within the ocean. Adaptation unfolds under pressure, not as a single response, but as a continuous adjustment to the environment. Each organism carries variations that interact with surrounding conditions, and those that align more closely with these conditions persist. Over time, this process shapes structure in ways that reflect the demands placed upon it. The resulting forms are records of these interactions, carrying within them the imprint of the pressures that guided their development. The consistency of certain outcomes suggests a degree of predictability. When similar constraints operate across different contexts, they tend to favor similar solutions. This does not imply that outcomes are fixed or inevitable, but it indicates that the range of viable forms is limited by the conditions in which life exists. Within this limited range, certain configurations arise more frequently, not by chance alone, but because they align with the constraints more effectively. Physics plays a central role in defining these constraints. The properties of water, the forces it transmits, and the materials available to living organisms all influence how bodies can be structured. Stability, efficiency, and resistance to force are not abstract qualities, but outcomes shaped by physical laws. Organisms that persist are those whose structures interact with these laws in ways that support continued function. Biological interactions add another layer to this shaping process. Predation, competition, and resource availability introduce additional pressures that refine which forms can endure. These interactions do not replace physical constraints, but operate alongside them, further narrowing the range of effective structures. Together, these influences create a framework within which adaptation occurs. Within this framework, the recurrence of certain forms reflects the interplay between variation and constraint. Different lineages, each with their own starting points, move through the same physical and biological landscape. As they do, their variations are filtered in similar ways, guiding them toward comparable outcomes. The similarities that emerge are not exact, but they reveal a shared response to the same underlying conditions. This perspective highlights the relationship between diversity and limitation. Life displays an extraordinary range of forms, yet this range exists within boundaries defined by the environment. The diversity observed is not infinite, but structured, shaped by the constraints that allow certain configurations to persist while excluding others. Over extended periods, these patterns accumulate, creating a record of how life responds to its surroundings. The repeated emergence of compact, stable bodies becomes one example within a broader set of recurring solutions. Each instance reflects the same balance between adaptation and constraint, between variation and the limits that shape it. In this way, the forms that persist offer insight into the principles that govern life on Earth. They reveal how survival is sculpted not by intention, but by the consistent influence of physical laws and environmental pressures acting over time. Over spans of time that stretch beyond immediate perception, a quiet pattern continues to surface. Separate lineages begin with different forms, follow distinct histories, and yet, as generations pass, their structures shift in ways that gradually align. The details differ, the paths remain independent, but the outcomes begin to resemble one another with increasing clarity. These events do not occur in a single moment or within a single lineage. They unfold across distant intervals, separated by millions of years, emerging in environments that share conditions but not continuity. One group begins with an elongated body, another with a form adapted to carrying external protection, and through gradual change, each moves toward a similar arrangement, compact, flattened, and closely integrated. The repetition becomes more apparent when viewed across these extended intervals. Each instance stands alone in its origin, yet when placed alongside others, a pattern forms. The recurrence does not depend on shared ancestry in recent time, but on the convergence of structures shaped by similar constraints. The alignment of these outcomes creates a sense of continuity that extends beyond individual histories. Fossil records preserve fragments of this process, offering glimpses into forms that existed between beginnings and outcomes. These records reveal transitions, bodies that retain traces of earlier structures, while adopting features that bring them closer to the compact form, seen repeatedly. Though incomplete, they provide a sense of progression, a gradual movement within each lineage that mirrors similar movements elsewhere. Modern analysis adds another layer, tracing relationships through genetic information. These studies confirm that the lineages involved remain distinct, their similarities not the result of recent common descent. The convergence exists despite separation, reinforcing the pattern as one shaped by shared conditions rather than shared origin. Across deep time, this repetition carries a certain quiet persistence. It does not dominate all forms, nor does it appear in every lineage, yet it returns often enough to become unmistakable. The shape emerges, fades in one lineage, appears in another, each instance contributing to a broader pattern that extends across eras. The continuity of this pattern reflects the enduring influence of the conditions that shape it. Physical forces, resource distribution, and interactions with other organisms remain present, shifting in detail but maintaining their overall effect. As long as these influences persist, the pathways that lead towards similar structures remain accessible. The sense of repetition does not imply exact duplication. Each instance carries its own variations, its own adjustments and refinements. The similarities lie in the overall structure, the way the body is arranged, rather than in identical detail. This balance between similarity and variation gives the pattern its character, recognizable yet never perfectly repeated. Within this unfolding, the shape becomes a recurring response, appearing when conditions align in ways that favor its structure. It reflects not a single event, but a series of independent movements toward a configuration that remains viable under consistent pressures. Seen across the breadth of time, these events form a quiet rhythm, separate histories moving in parallel, converging in form without merging in origin. The repetition remains, carried forward by the same interplay of variation and constraint that continues to shape life in the present. There is a quiet tendency to imagine direction where there is only process, when forms repeat across time, when separate histories arrive at similar outcomes. It can feel as though something is guiding them, arranging each step toward a shared result. Yet the movements that shape life unfold without foresight, without intention, guided instead by the steady influence of conditions that remain present across generations. Variation continues in every lineage, arising through small differences that accumulate over time. These differences do not move toward a goal, but they encounter an environment that filters them, allowing some to persist while others fade. The patterns that emerge from this filtering can appear ordered, even purposeful, because they reflect consistent pressures acting again and again. Within this continuity, repetition becomes visible. Similar structures arise not because they are sought, but because they remain viable under the same constraints. The ocean, with its forces and limitations, does not direct life toward a single form, yet it shapes the possibilities available. As different lineages move through these possibilities, their paths can align, producing outcomes that resemble one another. The absence of intention does not remove the sense of coherence. Instead, it reveals how order can emerge from simple, repeated interactions between variation and constraint. Each instance of convergence reflects the same underlying balance: structures that manage force, conserve energy, and maintain stability within the environment. These qualities persist because they support continued existence, not because they are chosen in advance. The pattern, once recognized, carries a certain stillness. It extends across deep time, appearing, fading, and reappearing in different forms, each instance connected not by direct lineage, but by the conditions that shape it. The repetition becomes a quiet rhythm, not imposed from above, but arising from the consistent application of physical and biological principles. Within this rhythm, the question of randomness and inevitability settles into a subtle balance. The variations that begin each transformation are contingent, shaped by chance and circumstance. Yet the constraints that act upon those variations guide them within a limited space where certain outcomes remain more likely than others. The pattern emerges from this interplay, neither fully random nor fully predetermined. The recurring form, seen across separate histories, reflects this balance. It stands as an expression of what remains possible within the boundaries set by the environment. Each appearance is independent, yet connected through the same underlying forces, creating a sense of continuity without direct inheritance. As the sequence of sections comes to rest, the pattern remains, extending beyond the narrative into the ongoing processes of life. It continues wherever variation meets constraint, wherever forms adjust to the conditions that surround them. The repetition persists, quiet and steady, shaped by the same influences that have guided it across time. If these reflections have lingered, if the pattern continues to unfold in thought, you can share that sense of observation below and remain with the unfolding story as it continues.